everybody, it's Baron with OneChiropractic again. We're with Dr. Richard Barwell. Really digging into this thing, man. Our last episode session was when we were starting to really get into kind of the deepness of the neurology of what's going on, and we're just kind of keep going deeper, right? I mean, today we're talking really about the cortex, and so we're getting deeper into the brain. But Doc, kind of share with us as we continue to go down this dive. Can you frame again kind of where we've been and kind of where we're headed and why we're at this point in this conversation?
Yeah, I think it's important because even though this is coming, day after day after day, it's coming at a fire hose level. So it's just, first thing we did was we talked about the fact that there are some challenges within the profession. We need to acknowledge what those challenges were. What I always sort of say is, we don't need to be mad at our critics. We need to be able to answer them. And when we can't answer them is when we get mad. So we do have answers now that we can move on, but we need to address the issues within the profession and start to realize that current science is changing our expression about what we do and how we do it and why we do it. We know that stressors are a major factor in the creation of vertebral subluxation. However, we found out that vertebral subluxation and that nerve root pressure left something to be desired as far as an explanation. So we started talking about what was going on with all of that concept and how it applies. And then we started looking at how the stressors actually create the vertebral subluxation and what the role of chiropractic is in redoing the nervous system so it can respond more appropriately. And what I want to do now is I want to continue on with this to get ready for what we're doing in the future. And I know what we're doing in the future. It's great stuff. So I want to start talking more about the brain function and actually show you exactly how these things all take place, how the stressors set up the patterns and the effect of the chiropractic adjustment on those patterns. So that's where I'd like to start today.
Awesome. Well, bring it to us, my friend.
Okay, so let's get going with this. I think there we go. We're up. So the foundations for neurologically based chiropractic, that's the whole idea of what we're doing, why we're doing it, is to give us a whole new direction. And we're taking chiropractic from pain to brain. And that to me is the whole purpose of all of this. We need to elevate our value and who we are and what we do, and do it in a method that's supported by current neuroscience that shows that chiropractic is really, really being short-sold out there in the field by just talking about its benefit for pain relief. I mean, that's not even getting near it. So let's take a look. I love this first slide, and let's take a look at what this means. There we go. So we have our universal influences. We talked about that. We talked about the universal intelligence, about being constantly in a state of change and being dynamic, and that's affecting us as to how we're going to live in a hostile environment that's constantly changing that we have to adapt to. So those universal influences are already affecting us, and our innate ability to respond it should be a subconscious level. Not even conscious, it should be a subconscious level there. So we're having this response and we're not even aware of it. And if we think that we have to wait until we become aware of the issue, we've got a problem because a whole bunch of other things have happened. With this subconscious innate response, we get innate neurological responses. It's our nervous system that is recording what's going on around us at a subconscious level and saying we need to adapt. The weather's cold outside, we need to adapt. We need to pick up the circulation. We need to make sure that there's good blood supply to the extremities. Otherwise, they're going to end up getting frozen and then gangrene and it will die. So it's already taking care of that. So we've got biochemical and mechanical changes going on still at the subconscious level. But at that level, we start to get habitual patterning getting formed up within the brain in that 95% of the brain that's functioning at a subconscious level and taking care of us to keep us alive in that universal influence going on. And then what happens with that patterning, if we get stuck into a pattern, because the brain doesn't self-regulate, it sets up a pattern and it tends to stay in there. And what happens then is our adaptability to those universal influences start to become impaired. When it reaches a level of threshold, when the brain can no longer say, I cannot deal with this anymore, you need to know we're in trouble, we get a conscious awareness going on, and that conscious awareness is when we have pain.
Right.
Pain or signs or symptoms. And if we continue to ignore that, we end up with system failure. And of course, that means we end up dying. So it's really interesting to take a look at sort of this level of influence that happens on the nervous system. And we need to then take a look and say, well, how do we measure this? How does this show up? If this is the case, we need to be able to show it, and we now can. So let's get started with this. I first want to talk about this thing called cortical brain activity. The cortex of the brain is where we store our memories. And the reason we store our memories is because the brain says, oh, that little event that just happened is important for survival, and I need to remember that. And the simplest example is a child with a hot pot. Mm-hmm. And if you've had kids, you got to go through this. Yep. Every one of us has learned this the hard way. And you can see the child reaching for something hot, and we say, hot, hot, and they go, hot, and they don't know what that means.
Right.
Yes, hot. And before you can get to it, they grab the pot, and then the screaming starts. Well, what happens the next time is they start to read, you say hot, they go, hot? I know what that means. That means pain. Because that pattern, that experience got stored in the cortex of the brain in a neural loop to say, this is important, remember this. We have so much, who we are is our stored memories based on our experiences that are stored in these cortical brainwave patterns. And we can take a look and see how they affected us. We can actually see what's going on because the neurons in the cortex, when that synaptic activity is going on and the neurons are firing the information back and forth, it creates an electromagnetic field. And we can measure that field now and take a look and see what kind of patterns are set up. So brainwave cortical activities are learned experiences built in hardwired neural patterns stored with emotional triggers. That's who we are. That's how we build our personalities. And most of this stuff, we don't even know why we got it stored. I mean, I can take people back to being under 10 years old into an experience that they went through, and they can tell me what clothes they were wearing. They can tell me where they were. They can tell me what they smell, what kind of taste is going on, what they see, because it's so imprinted because it was an important memory that it uses all of that impact to imprint that memory. All the senses are involved.
And here's the interesting part of that, and sorry to interrupt, but the interesting part of this is, I mean, if you really want to go deeper, I mean, this is where every fear comes from. This is where phobias come from that emotional response that your body now said, that was a very traumatic event for us. We're going to prevent that from happening again. So it stores that memory. And what we're finding now that's interesting, and this is in no way a knock on psychology or psychiatry, but they have a hard time breaking those patterns by just sitting there getting you to talk and relive it, because when you're reliving it verbally, your body goes into that same neurological response. And this is why we do find for our patients that are getting adjusted and doing that type of work, phenomenal results, because we're breaking that pattern, correct?
I had the great privilege of working with a psychologist many years ago, working with a very special child. And then we saw incredible results when we added the chiropractic. This child came back to normal life. And so we started working together. And I went to a bunch of programs at University in Victoria on psychology with her. And it was just, I would recommend that you find a psychologist in your area to be able to work with that understands what we're talking about here. Because when you can explain chiropractic from a neurological standpoint and how it affects the cortical activity, they get it. And all of a sudden they have an opportunity. See, here's the thing, when you can relive by talking through an experience, the biggest thing about that is if you can get to the point where they realize that's why they caused their reaction, that this in memory that they got imprinted was at a subconscious level and driving them, and they realize that the event wasn't what they thought it was, then they can make a break. But we can help them 10 times more than that because we can do a neurological pattern interrupt that reaches the cortex.
And this is where things like electrical shock therapy and all those things came to try to do that type of stuff, right? To try to break up that stuff. But that was so violent and so aggressive that, you know, you had side effects, which is typically what we see with drugs. But man, essentially, and correct me if I'm wrong, but an adjustment is similar to a safer method of getting in there and jolting that without strapping on and throwing, 100,000 current or volts of current through your brain.
Well, if you really want to compare them, and we'll get to this, the adjustment is a neurological pattern interrupt that creates a shock wave that reaches the cortex and allows a pattern interrupt. And I'm going to get into this a whole lot deeper.
I know, I'm jumping ahead. I'm sorry. I get so dang excited when this all comes together for me.
When we realize that, that's the point. When we realize what chiropractic is truly all about, and we kick it upstairs to the brain, and also have the ability to prove it now, to show it live time, it really changes what we bring to the table.
Yeah.
We need to get this through our head as chiropractors, that we need to stop talking about back pain and neck pain and vertebral subluxation and spinal curves, even though I'm not saying that any of this stuff isn't important, but I think what we really do is 10 times more important because it's going to affect everything downstream.
That's exactly right.
So getting that concept, this is the key right here. And we don't take this in school. We never learned anything about cortical activity. Even the guys doing the programs that are out there,
I hear you.
The neurological programs, the functional neurology type advanced, don't talk about cortical activity. They skip it completely. And it's like, you can talk about limbic system responses and you can talk about vestibular responses, but unless you're dealing with the hard wiring that's driving all of that, you're still missing the boat.
Right.
So that's why cortical activity is so important. We're going to get into the nitty gritty of this on this series. So you bear with me because this is important stuff. So how do we measure this? It's been around for like 60 years. We are looking at EEG, electroencephalograph work, how we're actually measuring brainwave activities. And the research done by the psychologists on this has got, it will load up your computer forever if you try to download everything that they've done the research. They did the work for us. We sort of saw this coming out back in the 1970s. They were talking about neurofeedback, and everybody sort of thought it was sort of a short wave to get to nirvana instead of having to do yoga or drugs. You could just do this stuff, but we missed the boat because it wasn't really fully understood at that time. Since then, the work that's been done is just staggering with EEG, absolutely staggering. So this picture you see here, there's a guy with like 110 connectors for the brain to measure this. Obviously, you can't do this in an office setting. This is for research work. And this is the kind of details that they're able to look at about what part of the brain is sending out what frequencies. And so they can map and see exactly what's going on. I was involved in a 21 lead cap with the research work we did with the psychologist I was working with. And that was a pain in the butt because you have to make sure you've got good connections with every one of those. As time has gone on, we've been able to develop pieces of equipment that are much more accurate and much easier and don't take this kind of work to do. So here's just something you need to look at. The cortex, memory storage, motor control, vision, hearing, language, numbers. That's all the stuff that's going on in there. It's where the information comes in and gets integrated into that brain. So the brain then works on all the information so that it can put out a motor response. The prefrontal cortex, critical thinking, concentration, organization, it's the conductor of the brain, and it has a direct hookup with the cerebellum. And I was just reading some work words today about the cerebellum. 80.2% of the neurons in the brain are located, this used to be 50%, now it's 80.2 are located in the cerebellum.
Wow.
All of a sudden, no wonder vestibular work is important. Right. Because that's going to be going directly to the cerebellum, because the cerebellum keeps us oriented in space. It keeps us upright. It keeps us able to move and adapt. If that's not working right, we got all sorts of problems. And there's a direct relationship between the prefrontal cortex that gets affected by stress very easily and the cerebellum. So all of a sudden, it's really important to sort of take a look at your patient and say, what's going on in your life? Like, what kind of patterns have been going on? What kind of stressors have you adapted to, maladapted to in your life? So the temporal region, memory, learning, and language. Right side, anxiety, depression, social challenges. Left side, irritability, aggressiveness, and violence. So now when we're talking about things like hemisphericity, what side of the brain is controlling and responding to certain stimuli, it becomes very important. If you have somebody that's suffering from depression or anxiety, or they're aggressive, we need to know where that brain is really upset and whether we should be adjusting from the right side or the left side. This is some of the work that Carrick started with a long time ago in hemisphericity. And it's good work, and it's stuff that we needed to look at and take a look, see what's happening. But we found out there's even more than simply left or right. So neurophysiological activity measurements. What we can take a look at with measuring cortical function and brainwave, we can see a 99% reproducibility. We've had this, doing that with the NeuroInfiniti. We've gone out to shows and we've taken people's EEG, we told them what the problems were, we suggested what kind of care that they should be getting, and we see them 2 years later, we say, oh, I want to get my brain checked again. So what did you do? Well, nothing. Right. So we do a test on them and we can lay the EEGs on top of one another. And nothing's changed. And nothing's changed in their life.
Right.
So the only way you're going to get change is if you can change the brain function, then you're going to get permanent change. If you're only treating signs and symptoms and getting rid of that and not getting rid of the cause of the problem, it's coming back. So cortical patterns offer a view of the programmed wiring of the brain built by the experiences of the patient. We get to start looking at the 95% subconscious patterning of the brain that they're not even aware is driving who they are personality-wise and response-wise. We can now take a look at and see what kind of patterns in there, and we can see what our effect of our adjustments are on changing those patterns. This is big stuff. We start talking to neurologists, neurosurgeons about this from a chiropractic standpoint, and their response is, why didn't you guys tell us this before?
Yeah. It's like you're only talking about half of the story, right? I mean, it's just kind of sad that you have this whole massive thing, and then, we've just, for whatever reason, we've chunked out this much of it, which is what's confused everyone because there's no context to any of that. Now you go from what you're talking about here in the brain patterns and the stressors, and that starts to explain the subluxation in a way that just about everyone that needs to know knows how it fits because of that neurological pattern and stressors and how it relates down into the physical anatomy. And yeah, it's just crazy.
Yeah, and so the actual subluxation is in the brain. Gee, right. Who ever said that before? Take a look at our history. That's already been built into our history. The subluxation is in the brain, and it creates the vertebral subluxation that does exist. And offers a gateway of being able to input massive amounts of sensory input by correcting that into the brain that breaks a pattern that says, what the heck was that? And then we need to retrain. Yep. So these patterns we see are the foundation of the patient's neurological response to the environment. That stuff I talked about in that chart.
Yep. These
are the patterns that set the course for the patient's health or illness in their future. And they're ingrained, they're there, we can measure them, we can start to see them from children on up. We can do brain testing on children from the age of about 5 on through. So we can catch these patterns, and we wonder why kids respond so quickly versus adults, because there isn't that much damage in the kids. And that brain is so willing to build new patterns and learn that a simple little pattern interrupt. In this business about adjusting babies, they have this picture that we lie them down on a rack on a table and jump on them. All we do with kids, you just touch them. Sometimes you just have to move them in a certain direction very gently, and that's all that it takes. When I was adjusting babies, I don't think I ever did a thrust on a baby, ever. It was always just a directional pressure and fall asleep in my hands. So it's like the people don't understand who we are and what we're really doing out there. And this is why, because we've been telling them the wrong stuff to begin with. And we just need to change our talk. So brain cells produce chemical and electrical signals called brain waves. The brain waves are gamma, beta, SMR, alpha, theta, delta. This is the stuff you have to learn now. Big deal. And I got to tell you, this is where I started getting excited when I started learning this stuff. People go like, oh, do I have to learn something new? When I started looking at this stuff and realizing that this is where chiropractic dealt with at this highest level possible in a human being, I wanted to know more. I wanted to get so excited about who I was and what I was doing that it turned my juices on and said, I can't get enough information. And I remember my mentor, Dr. Annette Long, telling me one day, and she's a psychologist, she's a clinical psychologist, and one of them that was involved in our research. She came to me and she said, I'm just so excited about learning more about the brain. This is when I was a neophyte. And I sort of looked at her and I went like, I can see you're excited, but share it with me, let me know where we're going with this. Well, I got there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks to her.
Absolutely.
So let's take a look. By the way, the reason that we use, when we do EEGs, we use the paste, it's called the wet application for taking the readings, is because we're measuring a millionth of a volt. A millionth of a volt. And you have to have good connections in order to get accurate data. And I don't apologize for taking extra time and doing wet leads rather than the dry leads, because the dry leads are only 75% accurate. That's not good enough. Right. As a chiropractic profession in this, we have to be 100%.
I agree.
We have to know exactly what we're doing and why we're doing it, and we have to use equipment that can't be challenged, and we don't make statements that we can't back up with good science behind it.
Absolutely.
That's the grounds we're on, and we are on solid grounds thanks to one lady by the name of Dr. Heidi Havoc. And what she has to offer, and she's going to take it from there, from where we are going with this, and really blow your mind, because she's our support group.
Yeah, she's going to be awesome. But Doc, I'm going to do what you hate me doing, but I'm going to stop us on this episode, because if we start going down this path to getting into this phase, we're going to add another 20 minutes onto this, and I refuse to reduce our format here. I want to do this in biteable chunks. So we're going to go ahead and pause this episode, and we'll pick right back up here, people. So we're not leaving you hanging just about 24 hours. All right. So
it's like a Saturday matinee where the mind blows up and the guy's in the mine shaft. He's died. No, we got to get back to the next one to find out what's going on.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So, man, I hope this continues to excite you. We keep getting deeper into this rabbit hole, but at the end of the day, remember, it's about having certainty and why you do what you do with the adjustment. I hope even in our conversations today, you start understanding why some of the things that have happened in your career have happened, right? Because now we're getting to what that adjustment actually does, that we're breaking up those patterns, that we're looking at the stressors. And unbeknownst to you, you are doing some unbelievable type of work. So we appreciate you watching this series. Please keep watching it. We're going to come back to you in 24 hours with the remainder of this particular talk. But don't give up on this. Please stick with it. I'm going to continue to remind you, share this with your colleagues. Let it blow their mind. Even if it's not blowing your mind, but there's something mildly interesting for you, send it to someone else, because maybe they're at a place in life that it'll blow their mind. But you can't argue the logic of what we're sharing here. You just can't. It's proven in every level of science, and we have proof on the results. So I don't want to argue with you about it, but I do want you to at least share the information, because if this goes viral, you're going to see a completely different movement happen within our profession, and that's the goal of what we're doing here at OneChiropractic. So, Dr. Barwell, thank you as always, and we'll see everybody tomorrow. God bless.